Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out and braving the warmth in here. There is a thermometer, but it just seems to be for show, so there's not much we can do to set it one way or the other to make it warmer or colder, so my apologies. My name is Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports a range of lectures, discussions, conferences, and discussions on campus that explore questions of that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can find a schedule of our events and video eventually of this talk, so your friends who didn't come, you can tell them what they missed, and see that online in a few days at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. Today's lecture is one of the Deichmann family lectures in religion and modernity. We're grateful to John Deichmann of the class of 1970 and to his family for making this possible. I'm especially pleased today to get to introduce the delightful Sylvester Johnson for an interdisciplinary exploration of the limits of sensory-driven artificial intelligence and the science of the soul. Dr. Johnson is a nationally recognized humanities scholar specializing in the study of technology, race, religion, and national security. Recently named Associate Vice Provost for Public Interest Technology at Virginia Tech, he's founding director of the Center for Humanities and executive director of the university's Tech for Humanity initiative. The initiative highlights the role of ethics, empathy, responsible innovation, equity, inclusion and diversity, sustainability, and more to ensure human thriving as advancements in technology continue to shape our world for decades to come. A professor of religion and culture, he's the author of The Myth of Ham in 19th Century American Christianity, a study of race and religious hatred that won the American Academy of Religion's Best Book Award in 2005, and African American Religions, 1500 to 2000, winner of the 2017 Choice Book Award. Dr. Johnson co-edited The FBI in Religion, Faith and National Security Before and After 9/11, and his current book project, which brings him here today, is titled Do Robots Have Souls? Religion, Race, and Humanity in an Age of Intelligent Machines. Prior to Virginia Tech, he taught religion and African American studies at Northwestern University, Indiana University, and Florida A&M. A founding co-editor of the Journal of Africana Religions, he's published more than 70 scholarly articles, essays, and reviews. Please join me in welcoming Sylvester Johnson.
Thank you very much. It's such a delight to be here with you this evening, and thank you to Professor Landry for the very generous invitation and introduction to all of you affiliated with the center here for the study of religion and ethics and society, and the attendees from, I understand, multiple departments here at the College of the Holy Cross. I'm really delighted to be invited with you to speak with you this evening. And this talk is a exploration of the intersection of some of the important developments in the long history of what is often called the science of the soul. So I hope you'll actually hear that phrase with a little bit of irony today. Those don't typically go together. If you take a science course, you probably will not be studying about a soul. And if that's part of your textbook in science, you should raise your hand and ask the professor to explain whether they're talking about this or something else. But for centuries, intellectuals throughout the world were concerned with this attempt to understand the workings of the soul. And I want to talk about the work of a particular individual, Ibn Rushd, who was a very influential scholar in the tradition of Islam, who actually had an outsized scale of influence on the Christian tradition, and particularly because of his research and his commentary on the Aristotelian approaches to understanding what things can do, the powers of the soul that I'll explain a little bit about. He is well known for his what's called a long commentary on Aristotle's treatise on the soul, which is referred to in Latin as the Anima. But this intersection is something that I see repeatedly emerging as a classical question that comes to us in new garb, so to speak, with the continued innovations that we see in digital technologies. And so I'll be talking about the science of the soul in relationship to intelligent machine applications, or more commonly known as AI. And part of what I'll be asking a question about in a attempt to answer is, what can things do? And what's the difference between what might be understood as inanimate or inorganic entities and things that are alive, and particularly animals and especially humans? The most simplistic way of putting this is that you've heard a lot of experts probably say that ChatGPT, which I imagine most of you have heard a little bit about at this point, doesn't actually know anything. Another way of putting that is that your GPS doesn't actually know anything, but it can tell you where to go. Right? And so one might say that the GPS doesn't know anything. It can sense directions, but you as a human driver might know something. And so I'm asking about that question. Is that really the case? Can things know things? Can things feel things? And so the book that I'm writing on around the question, do robots have soul, is really a way of getting to that question. And so I've entitled this talk, Can Robots Feel Pain? And as I'll explain, the pain is a way of getting at some of the complexity that many people will talk about with reference to consciousness. Right? Can machines be conscious? So I'm asking pain, and I'll try to explain why I'm using pain as I go along. I'll try to answer that question at the end, and I do have an answer. It might not be the right one, but I will propose an answer, and then we can hopefully have a very vigorous discussion in which you can tell me why you disagree with me, because hopefully it'll be a little controversial. All right, so let's get started. So this is an image of a robot that was marketed by a company called Kinky's Dolls, that in 2018 attempted to open a store in the city of Houston, Texas. These fantasy dolls, as you will see advertised here, are very much indicative of the stereotypes about femininity and sexual attraction. These dolls were engineered as sex robots, and the business model was that a robot brothel would operate in the city of Houston so that presumptively heterosexual identified male clients would go to this brothel. They could pay by the hour to have an experience, a sexual experience with the robot. And if they wanted to invest in the technology, they could actually buy a sex robot for around $10,000. So this is 2018. So that's way back in pre-pandemic times. I call BC times, before the coronavirus, half a decade ago. But the controversy is telling. 2018, the City Council of Houston was not happy to hear about this proposition. Kinky's Dolls was already operating in Canada. The founder of that company was attempting to expand and to add something else. They had sold robots in Canada. Here in Houston, they were going to sell not only robots, but the hourly time with the robots, okay? So the response by the City of Houston's council was quite telling. The council was completely opposed to this. Many residents of Houston weighed in and claimed that this was going to destroy the moral character of Houston, that it would be harmful to actual human women who might not be able to find male suitors anymore because they would all be renting time with the sex bots. As you can see from what are representative images of these robots, they're also very racially specific in the presentation of the dolls. So this is based on a white norm of femininity, and not just any white, but of course they're blonde. The body styles of the dolls fit a lot of stereotypes that have been repeatedly critiqued by not just feminist scholars, but by people at large in public in the 21st century as problematical ways of thinking about feminine norms. The city council actually forced the company to change their plans. They were not able to open this brothel. And it's not to say, I don't want to give the impression that no one was in support of this brothel, But overwhelmingly, the response in the city of Houston was actually quite negative. Interestingly, however, to me, of all the different arguments that were raised to oppose the operation of this brothel, almost no one said anything about the robots themselves. And if you look at scholars who are writing about sex bots, however, there's a lot of attention to the issue of whether being able to have access to a sex bot that is engineered as a female robot would not only encourage the practice of sexually violent behavior toward the robot, because we already have sexually violent behavior that is affecting our society globally, and it happens across our society, including very much US society, with human biological women. And a number of scholars have pointed to what happens when you have a robot where the user can say, well, this is not even a human, so I can do anything that I want. Will you not see an increase in routinizing and making more practiced sexually violent, exploitative behavior that's really predatory? And so one might ask if, and these bots were not engineered, by the way, for sensation. I'm going to get into that. Some machines are, these were not. But if they were, could it be possible that machines might one day, if they were advanced enough, might actually experience pain? In other words, is the question of violence toward the bots themselves not part of what might be some ethical concern over this business model? Well, Kinky's Dolls went ahead to operate in Houston, but not with selling time with the robots. They could only just sell the robots to any user who wanted to buy them. And if someone wanted to pay thousands of dollars, they could buy a robot. They just couldn't rent time by the hour. They couldn't have the brothel business model, but they could just sell robots to people, and that's what they did. The question of pain, so the gist here is, these robots were not engineered for sensation, but if they were, would it even be conceivable that a robot could feel pain? Now, that might sound like a rather far-fetched question, but I'll circle back to it with a little bit more precision about engineering machines for sensation. But what I want to say with this slide is that any experience or understanding of pain has to attend to the fact that pain, like the category of human, is not merely a biological category or physiological category. It's also a political category. And what I mean by that is that pain, like the category of human, has been applied unevenly to populations around the world, reflecting political realities and power differences. And so this slide is an illustration by the artist Robert Thomas, who entitled this illustration of Marion Sims with one of the women that he enslaved, Anarcha. So the woman who's in the center of this painting, Anarcha, was a historical person who was enslaved by Marion Sims. Marion Sims is the celebrated father of gynecology, the medicine of pregnancy and childbirth and women's reproductive health. Marion Sims was not entirely, but was significantly responsible for tremendous advances in women's reproductive health. He lived during the 1800s. He performed without anesthesia, lots of experimentation on black women who were enslaved. And they were not able to prevent this experimentation because they were enslaved. If you cut your finger, and you think about how painful it is because you have lots of nerve endings and concentrated in different parts of your bodies, your tongue, for example, your fingertips, but also genital tissue. This was arguably one of the most painful ways to experiment on anyone because he was cutting on their genitalia. And he ended up creating some important insights into gynecological care and health, but he did so because he was willing to experiment on people in ways that constituted torture against these women when they had no protection from such. And so this artist is portraying with some sense of dignity because Anarcha is wearing clothes in this image. Of course, she was unclothed in real life. And to your right is Marion Sims, to your left are the medical students who are observing Sims, and they're learning from his experimentation. And then you see to your extreme left the other women who were enslaved who are looking onto this scene. And so this artist is trying to capture this period of history. Marion Sims, as I said, was widely celebrated. There were many efforts to try to memorialize the contributions that he made to modern science and healthcare, but he's also come under a lot of criticism, especially more recently, because experimenting and torturing these women was actually very central to what he did. And he claimed, in his defense, he claimed that black people, as a race, were not able to experience pain in the same way that the white race was able to experience pain. And he understood the sensation of pain to be directly proportional to one's attainment to full humanity. So he did not say exactly that black people were not human, but their level of humanness was beneath that of the white race. He didn't invent that idea by himself. The dehumanizing strategies that were meant to try to rationalize and justify a very harmful and deadly and oppressive practices of slavery, of torture, of carceral systems, et cetera, were very much a part of his day. But he was using those claims in order to justify the torture. These women, of course, did feel pain. There's no way to do what he did on these women without their screaming in pain and being agonized by it, and he knew that. It's just not possible to do what he did and not see people respond to that pain. But that was his rationale, and there are many instances of this kind of thing where the very experience of pain itself is functioning, as I say, as a political category. So it's not that one can simply take pain for granted. It's actually a very complicated thing. And precisely because of its subjectivity, it's very helpful as not simply an analog for trying to get at consciousness, but as an object of study in its own right. And so in the book, it's something that I use not to try to replace the questions about consciousness and sentience, but to set something else alongside categories of being sentient or being conscious in order to also grapple with some of the things that actually impinge upon our lives in a more visceral way. When I say that pain is subjective, what I mean is that if you go to a doctor and you're complaining about pain, the doctor will not pull out a pain-ometer. There is no such thing as an objective observation or measure of pain. The doctor, in fact, they can be the world's greatest expert in pain, but they will ask you to tell them about your pain. And they may give you a little scale from 1 to 10. And they may say 1 is, you can barely feel this pain. 10 is you think you're going to pass out. Tell me where you are. You're the only person, you're the only subject who can attest to your pain. You're the only person who can experience it. You're the only person who can observe it. In that way, it has the lack of any kind of objectivity as something that people can actually see and observe. It's purely subjective. That does not mean that pain is not real. It's very real. But no one else can look into you and see your pain. You have to tell them what you're experiencing. And so it's that way with sentience and consciousness. And so that's a little bit of me trying to just clarify why that's here. Okay. So can robots feel pain? Pain is this very subjective kind of experience. It is useful as an analogy for understanding why it is difficult and elusive to, if not impossible, to objectively study consciousness or sentience, but is also useful in its own right, beyond its value as an analogy, because pain is so much an important part of our reality. So I want to spend a few minutes, so I've set up the question of, robots feel pain, that's a subjective thing. I'm going to come back a little later and tell you why it's important that machines are being engineered for sensation. Okay? But I want to talk about this person, Ibn Rushd, and this is the anchor for this talk. Ibn Rushd lived during the 12th century. He was, as I said, one of the most influential philosophers / theologians / scientists in not just the Aristotelian tradition, but also more broadly in efforts to understand what were the capacities of the soul. So 2 points that I'll explain here. What did he claim, and what was the science of the soul, and why is that significant for what we're doing? So he was in the Aristotelian tradition, means thousands of years ago. Aristotle, very important person who worked across what we today would call disciplines. So he wrote about what we would call biology and political science and natural science and philosophy, etc. He wrote a text that was about psyche in the Greek, de anima in the Latin, the soul in English. The soul might be a little bit less than the best way to interpret what he was trying to get at as a term, because we have different ways of thinking about the soul. One scholar has called the term the animator, maybe the best way to get at what he meant by the soul. So he was trying to explain in this text, and he wrote lots of things, but his De Anima was concerned with this question: what makes things alive? How do you know something's alive? And what does that even mean? And his answer, this is Aristotle, okay, not Ibn Rushd. His answer was that things are alive because there is something that gives them the ability to experience the activity of being alive. Those activities are things like the ability to grow, to consume nutrition, to change, to respond to external stimuli, etc. And he called that a psyche in the Greek, in the Latin translation, de anima. One can think of it as the animator. It's what's giving those things the ability to carry out life activities. He also said, in contradistinction to most of his contemporaries, that this soul is not eternal, that it doesn't live forever, that it dies. And that's why things that are alive stop being alive at some point, because the soul stops, it ceases to function, and it's not eternal. That question that he raised about what makes things alive had centuries of interpretation. So by the time you get to the 12th century, the Common Era, Ibn Rushd is writing, and there are lots of ideas about the set of powers of the soul. Ibn Rushd weighs in a very expansive way, and he innovates in this tradition in important ways. And one of the things that he writes is here in this quote, that the intellect, he says, is neither a body nor a power in a body. So I want to explain why that's important. Okay? The intellect is neither a body nor a power in a body. What he means by that, it's not made of material. Okay, that's what he means by body. And it's not located inside of something that's made of material. The intellect is a power of the soul, not of the body. All right? He didn't invent that particular idea. He expanded it in some very interesting and innovative ways. Why is it so important for Ibn Rushd that that intellectual activity not be located in something physical? And one helpful way of understanding this is to use something that we know today. So we know that whenever your body is perceiving sound or you are viewing colors, that what you see and hear is based on the specifics of your particular material apparati of your body in particular. So you may know someone who has perfect pitch, for example. I have a sister who has perfect pitch. I don't have perfect pitch. And I was always jealous because she could hear a sound or a note or someone singing, and she would say, that's in the key of E flat. Or nope, they're singing in the key of D. I was like, how do you know that? I could walk over to the piano and I could hit D and I could find C or E flat and I could figure it out. But when she heard that sound, she heard E flat. That's what she heard. I just hear a sound and I could go to the piano and pick it out. But her body's different from mine. We hear sounds in a different way. It's not just those who have perfect pitch and those who don't. We see colors in a different way. So you might think that this is a shade of yellow or beige or brown, but you don't see exactly the same color as someone else. Not only that, you might start to see different things over the course of your life, because guess what? Your material doesn't stay the same. Your body doesn't stay the same your whole life. It keeps changing. We experience the world through material, one, that is unique to us as individuals, and two, that keeps changing even within the life space of the individual. And so the gist of this intellect not being material is this. If people are experiencing the world using different instrumentation, different bodies, different material, none of them have exactly the same instrumentation as anyone else, and even individuals themselves don't keep the same instrumentation over the course of their lives. Their bodies keep changing. And that's what happens. So if that's true, how is it possible for people to experience the same objective reality? How is it that you can hear the happy birthday song, or you can see a painting, or you can experience some event or emotion? Joy, for example, love, aspiration, and participate in some kind of common reality, be it human or divine, but all of us have different material. Okay, so that was what the science of the soul was trying to answer. And that's a really good question, whether or not you believe in the soul. And just so you know, I'm not investing in the theology of the soul. In fact, I actually disagree with where Ibn Rushd goes, but that's because he was way smarter than I am. I've read him. He's way smarter than I am. We don't have to reach the same conclusions for me to understand that I should be a student of his rigor, because he was working across many different disciplines, and he was very sophisticated. And the question of how you can have a common reality and a common experience, a common knowledge, even though your instrumentation is different, even though your body's different, that's actually a really good question that we have not figured out as a human society. I mean, people claim things, but we don't have agreement about them. But that's an example of why the science of the soul was important. Because people can experience reality, they can have knowledge of things. Even though all their bodies are different, all their material is different, and it keeps changing over their lives, what the science of the soul said is that knowledge, the ability to experience the world, to participate as an intelligent actor, is not due to material. It's due to something that's not material. And that stuff that was not material was called the soul. And that's why the soul was important in this tradition. Whether or not you think there's a soul, it's the question of how do you explain this problem of the universal with all of these particulars. And so what Ibn Rushd taught is that there cannot be the intelligence residing in the material thing, and it can't be a material entity itself. And so I'm going to give you an example of Ibn Rushd explaining something, then I'm going to explain something else, and then I'm going to get back to AI and pain. All right. So this is just an illustration of the perception of truth. Remember, the science of the soul is asking this question. If everyone has different material, how do you take your unique material and experience a common reality? And we'll work with one of those realities, knowledge and truth, by just experiencing a tree. So his example, how does a person see a tree? Well, he knew, as people centuries before he knew, that we have apparati that perceive light. Let's call it ocular sensing. So one of the distinctions that Ibn Rushd makes is between sensing and knowing. So if he were here with us today, Ibn Rushd would say there is a thermostat or a light sensor, or we have sensors on our cars. They're machines, and they can detect things. So a thermostat will respond to temperature. You can set it on a certain temperature, and it'll send an electrical signal to modulate an HVAC system. Or the light on some setting, a light sensor might detect something. So certain lights come on automatically, and that's because they're sensing. Or some traffic lights are designed to sense the approach of cars. But Ibn Rushd would tell us, as will the traffic light engineer today, that the traffic light doesn't actually know what a car is. And the traffic light doesn't actually know a car is coming. The engineer and Ibn Rushd would tell us today, they would agree that the traffic light, all it's doing, it's sensing, it's just responding to physical stimuli, and it has no idea of what's going on, okay? And then there's knowledge. And Ibn Rushd would say that people can actually know a car is coming. So here we go with this example. The eyes and the optical nerves receive light bouncing off of that tree. And so that's the sensing part. The science of the soul had worked out a very elaborate way of understanding how you get from that to knowledge. And so part of this was that there were different activities that went on to create what we call intelligence. And some of that was imagination, which was based literally on image, that the the intelligence was actually using pictures of the world, even if there were a sound, even if it were a feeling, everything was turned into a picture. And that's why the word image is in our word imagination, because it's the importance of taking a picture of everything or turning everything into a picture, all right? So images. And then memory. Those images would get scattered about. Memory was a function understood to be, and it actually still is, that can take those different pictures and put them back together again. And so if you watched the Super Bowl yesterday, you have pictures, even the sounds, according to this theory, you've taken pictures of everything, and then that was yesterday, now it's today, and someone asked you, do you remember the Super Bowl? And you'll think back and you'll have all those images, even if you turn them back into sounds, and you will say yes. So what you're doing, according to the science of the soul, is taking the different pictures that got separated and put into different parts, and you're remembering them. They got dismembered, so now you're remembering. You're putting back together, and that's why remembering is called remembering, because you're putting back together things that got dismembered, right? And that allows you to recall. That's the activity of memory. And then you have, in this science of the soul, the active and passive intellect, and one of those parts tries to approximate the thing that it's trying to understand. It tries to, it never becomes what it's trying to represent, but it sort of starts to look like it. In order, but remember, the intellect is not material, okay? So it can never become any of these material things. It can only approximate them. And then the passive intellect finishes up that activity, and it allows those different, what started out as sensations, what became, I'm going to say, spiritualized, dematerialized, to become knowledge and understanding. Remember, this is just light bouncing off a tree. That's all it is. But that's not what's happening when people experience knowledge. You're actually experiencing something else. It's not just the light bouncing off a tree. So let me just make that point with this slide. How many of you have ever had a dream? Probably all of you could raise your hand, right? You could dream about anything. It could be swimming in an ocean. It can be running a race. You don't need to be around an ocean, and you don't need to be running a race. What allows you to do that is the fact that we not only depend upon sensing in order to experience the world. You can take away those external stimuli, take away the sensations. You could be in your comfortable feather bed, dreaming about swimming in the ocean, but there's no ocean. You can feel the waves. You can hear the seabirds flying above you, even though there are no birds in your bedroom. How's that happening? Because when you experience what you call seeing the tree, this is what's really happening. There is light bouncing off that tree. It is stimulating different cells in your body, optical nerves, auditory nerves. And those cells, so this is today, okay? This is not 12th century, this is today, science of vision. Those cells start to use the sodium-potassium pumps, different concentration of ions, in order to create a difference in the positive and negative ionic concentrations around those cells. And that creates an electrical pattern. That's what's happening. It's a pattern of electricity. That's it. And it can move across different cells in your body, but it's a pattern of electricity, okay? Think about your favorite food. Think about the best meal you ever had, or the most memorable experience you've ever had. Are you thinking about electrical signals? No. You're thinking about feelings. The taste of chocolate is not electricity. It's the taste of chocolate. It's an experience. In other words, signals are one thing. But what happens on the other side of this processing is not signaling. It's something else. And it can come from the signaling, but it doesn't actually need the signaling. You can go dream this up. You can remember it right now. You can experience those things all over again. And sometimes in ways that are very disruptive. We have something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. PTSD is very traumatizing for people. It can be very disruptive of their ability to live a normal, healthy life because they are creating an experience of something in the absence of that something. And it can actually be very upsetting. Or it can be joyous. You might have a warm fuzzy because you remember meeting your best friend, even though you just saw them, maybe it's been 2 or 3 weeks ago, but you can experience it right now, okay? That's what the science of the soul was trying to explain. How do you account for the differences between those things? How do you go from these physical activities to this stuff over here, that's this experience? Sure, it can happen in response to signaling, but you don't actually need the signaling. How do you explain that? And so one of the things that we want to appreciate about the implications of this tradition of trying to figure out how you explain that question. And I just want to reiterate, I'm not trying to claim there's a soul. I'll get to that in a moment. But that's, whether you believe in the soul or not, that's actually not important for appreciating the rigor of what's going on and the difficulty of this question that is still with us today, and it keeps popping up with new examples. One more thing. There's an interesting physiology to pain that pain experts cannot yet figure out, and maybe we will, but it's a question. And the gist of it is that there are certain cells in biological organisms that create electrical signaling specific to things that we experience as being painful. I'll say that again. There are specific cells in biological organisms that produce electrical signaling specifically in response to things that we consider painful. Just those things, all right? How do those cells know to respond only to those things and not other things? Remember, there's signaling, and then there's the experience of pain. And we also know, by the way, that not everyone experiences pain the same way. In fact, there are some things that one person might experience to be painful that someone else might experience to be pleasurable. But how do those cells know what to do? Okay, this is an interesting question. But they're called nociceptors, and this is an illustration of those cells. When they sense something, they will trigger a process of electrical signaling that passes through the CNS, the central nervous system. Again, there's signaling and then there's experience. What we do with that signaling, we call pain. But what's very clear is that it's not equal to the signaling, but it's not separate from the signaling. And we do have a common human experience of pain. In fact, many scientists have claimed, although with disagreement from others, that pain is not just a human experience. Now, my grandmother would be shocked by this because she just assumed, she didn't assume, she would claim that she knew that lots of things experience pain. It was not just a human phenomenon. But this is actually a debate among biologists, whether pain is something unique to human beings. But the point is that there's a lot of complexity even in the cells that are responsible for this sensation of pain. All right. So what I've laid out so far is that we have the robots that are, by the way, being engineered to more closely resemble certain capacities of humans. We have this tradition of the science of the soul in which, as far back as the 12th century, someone who was way smarter than I am, whether or not we agree with our conclusions, way smarter than I am, produced a very compelling account of the intellect as something that could not be explained through simply material conditions based on some assumptions he was making. And we have this experience of pain that goes from signaling to something else. So I want to come back to the AI, all right? So for years now, more than 20 years now, machines have, actually more than 40 years now, machines have been engineered to be neuromorphic, and that just means they have been based on a paradigm of the biology of signal processing, information processing. So when you and I are experiencing things, whether we're adding up a math problem or we're walking down the street or we're trying to navigate a conversation with someone, what's going on beneath the hood is actually very impressive. There's a lot of handling of information. Most of it, by the way, we're not even conscious of. We're not even aware of. We don't consciously, we love to talk about what humans know, and I'm getting a little bit into my claim now, and what machines can't know. But we actually aren't aware of most of the things that we're experiencing. And at a certain point, we may experience knowing something, but by the time that happens to us consciously, a lot has already gotten processed. A lot has gone on, and we will not be aware of it. Machines are being designed based on this with AI, and the way that's happening is to create networks of processing power, networks of transistors. So the gist is that just as one cell will generate a signal that triggers other cells, so also will one set of transistors, if they reach a signaling threshold that's high enough, they'll output signals to other transistors, and over time, what you get is a pattern whereby certain calculations, certain outputs will happen given a certain set of inputs. I'll give you the biological analogy. Most of us have witnessed a child learning to speak, so I'm going to use the example of an apple, okay? Parent has a child, or it could be someone else, I'll just pretend it's the parent, has a child, and they're trying to teach the child to talk, and they say to the baby, apple, and they hold up the object, okay? So lots of stuff is going on, but I'm going to be reductive because I have just a few minutes left. And so let's just say two things. The child is hearing the word apple, and the child is seeing the object that we call apple, right? So when the parent says apple to the child, what happens to the child's signaling? Well, their auditory nerves are processing the vibrations in the air that result when the person says the word apple. It's like you're listening to me right now. Vibrate the air. That creates vibrations in the child's cochlear gland, stimulates other nerves. The auditory nerves goes into the brain's network. And that auditory signal produces a sound, and this is the child producing that sound, by the way. I'll get to that in a moment, because you're producing the sound of my voice right now, but I'll get back to that. Apple. And at the same time, there's a visual set of signaling that's going on. They see this object. So what happens organically is that the nerve cells that get excited when the child hears the word apple start to build connections to the nerve cells that get excited. In other words, that emit signaling. When the child sees the objects, it is a physical connection that gets formed between two communities of cells. Do you get that? One community of cells gets excited, another community of cells gets excited, the first on an auditory input, the second on a visual input, and they start to connect to each other. They build a network, okay? So that's called a neural network. But anytime you hear AI and you hear someone who's trying to talk about it in a technical way, they may use a phrase, an artificial neural network. Maybe you've heard that. If you haven't, don't worry about it. The point is that the AI is being designed the same way. The AI that is trained by machine learning. AI that's designed to be able to come up with answers to questions that it's never had before. Okay, it's a certain kind of AI. And most of the AI that you're experiencing today is that. Whenever you're telling your car which direction to go, or you talk to Siri, or you ask directions, or you get on ChatGPT and ask it to summarize, whatever. That's what it's doing. It's based on that paradigm. This is why we call it neuromorphic. Right? The ability of machines that have been engineered this way to produce outputs to very difficult kinds of questions and scenarios is simply astounding. And there are all kinds of criticisms that are legitimate critiques of AI. I'm not trying to romanticize AI. It's just like everything else. It has all kinds of problems and issues, okay? But that doesn't mean that there's not something to appreciate about the difficulty of what's going on. And so one of the demonstrations of the power of this technology is AlphaGo. AlphaGo was an AI system developed, and it still exists, AI system developed way back in BC, before coronavirus times, back in 2016. That was 7 years ago, by a company called DeepMind. DeepMind, by the way, was acquired by Google in 2014. Okay? And it still runs its operations, but it's a subsidiary now of Google. DeepMind, by the way, forced Google to create an ethics board before Google could acquire DeepMind, because DeepMind, that company, realized, its founders realized what they were creating was so sophisticated that it was going to raise all kinds of ethical issues, and that they thought there needed to be some kind of ethical oversight over that, okay? So there have been different varieties of the alpha AI products, but this one that you see pictured here is called the AlphaGo because it is an AI system that taught itself to play the game of Go, which is a classical game that started in China. It's become global. And it takes people years to learn the strategy, not to become good at the strategy, just to learn it. It takes even more years to become really good at Go as a strategy. It's way more, you think about the difference between checkers and chess. Okay, it's exponentially more complicated than chess. And one way to program a machine to do something is just to give it a bunch of instructions. If you see one, do this. If you see two, do that. Or you can use this neuromorphic process where you just give it a bunch of inputs and you let it observe patterns, and then you give it new questions that it's never had before. And based on those patterns it's seen, it comes up with new answers. Okay? And that's basically what happened here. It was given thousands of examples of Go games. And based on that pattern, the ability to identify patterns, it taught itself to play Go so well that it defeated Lee Sedol, who was a great world champion. And first, Lee Sedol beat the AI before it beat him. Okay, Lee Sedol won first. But eventually, it actually beat him. Okay? Now, the game is so sophisticated, it's so complicated, that if you tried to sit down and write a rule book for this and then feed it into a computer system, you probably need generations of people to finish it for you because it would take too long. You'd have to get your descendants to agree to carry on the work, and they'd lose interest and do other stuff, so it probably never happened. But if you use this process of machine learning, where you just ingest lots of examples and use software that recognizes patterns really well, you can end up with something that's quite useful. So that's just one example. Another example, most of you have actually dealt with this. If you've jumped on OpenAI's platform and did ChatGPT, what you're seeing as a result neuromorphic architectures. That you can ask it questions that's never been asked before, but based on things it's seen before, it can generate answers. Sometimes they're wrong answers, by the way. All right? I'm not trying to romanticize AI. But even if they're wrong answers, you probably know human beings who have given wrong answers at some point in their lives. I mean, that's just not a reason to just entirely, completely dismiss something. You still want to appreciate the challenge of what's going on, even while we have very good critiques. So I'll end with this. So this is an image of Barack Obama and Nathan Copeland. Can machines feel pain? Or could robots feel pain? And I mean that as a hypothetical. I don't mean to ask with the question I should have said in the beginning, can every single robot ever made feel pain? Although there's no reason to completely remove that question, I actually intend this in a more particular kind of way. As a hypothetical, could it be? Is it at least possible? Is it at least plausible that a robot might feel pain? But if I write the title that way, I mean, no one wants to read a subjunctive title of a talk, right? Give them the indicative. So Nathan Copeland is pictured here to your right. He was implanted with a brain chip. So he has a spinal cord injury due to traumatic brain injury, and he is pictured here shaking hands. So Barack Obama is shaking hands with a robot arm. Can you make that out? It's not the clearest because there's a black curtain behind the black hand. It's a robot's hand. Makes it hard to see the robot hand, but you can see Barack Obama's hand. So he's shaking hands, I'm going to say, with Nathan Copeland. All right? Nathan Copeland is not only controlling that hand, Nathan Copeland can feel Barack Obama's hand. Yeah. He can feel Barack Obama's hand. He's shaking his hand. And when he does, here in this, Nathan Copeland, who's on the right, feels Barack Obama's hand. How does he do that? Okay. So he has a brain implant. He has a multi-array electrode that is engineered and sold by the BlackRock Neurotech company. This brain chip was implanted into Nathan Copeland back in 2014, so almost 10 years ago. And by the way, almost anyone who has a brain chip today, more than 90% of them are implanted because of this company. It's the BlackRock Neurotech Corporation. They are the leader in designing these chips. He has a traumatic brain injury. He's not able, without the chip, to move his hands or his legs. So he's in a wheelchair here. But he wanted restored capacity. So he asked to be implanted with this brain chip that was developed by BlackRock Neurotech. So when you connect a machine, AI, and this is AI running this chip, some machine chip to a person's biological neural tissue, that's called a brain-to-computer interface, or BCI, brain-computer interface. You hear people talk about BCI architectures. They're talking about chips, machine chips that are connected somehow to people's biological nerve cells, usually the brain, not always the brain. Okay? In this case, so you see a picture of the chip to the right, and you can get a sense of what the size of it. You see the different electrodes on that chip. That's why it's called the multi-array brain chip. The precision of this type of surgery has a long way, and it is surgery. You don't just go to CVS and get one of these and just, like AirPods. This is invasive surgery. And it is experimental. And this is still early days. This is still very much early in R&D. He's continuously implanted. What that means is that Nathan Copeland does not take this out like contact lenses at night. He doesn't take it out every 6 months. It's in there. And it's going to stay in there until something better comes along or until something starts to happen that might require it to be removed, but it's continuously implanted. Some people do these things where they're testing for a while and then it's removed, not him. So back in 2014, he had this, he still has this today. The brain-computer interface technology can work in a couple of ways. One way is to allow a person to control, in this case, the robot arm by thinking, and that's what's happening with him. But they can't, the arm will respond to what the person is thinking through the brain signaling, but the person might not be able to feel anything. Okay, so that's called the one-way signaling, meaning they think of, in this case, Nathan Copeland thinks of reaching out and shaking Barack Obama's hand. So that produces a very specific type of signaling. All of us do this, whether or not you actually reach out your hand. I can tell you right now, don't stand up, okay? But I can tell you right now, okay, stand up. Now, don't stand up. But when I say that, you will think about standing up. And you will create a set of signals, of electrical signaling, that for you is standing up. For your cells will recognize it. And it'll be similar to someone else's signal. It won't be exactly the same, but it'll be similar. But every time you stand up, that's the signal for you. Or if I say, it could be, scratch your left ear, right? Maybe you do it like this. But every time you do this, it's exactly the same signal, every time, for you, okay? Someone else's signal, a little bit different. But when they do it for them, it's the same signal. And so that's one way. The other way is called closed loop or two-way BCI. And that is not only can the robot arm receive the signal that the person's thinking of, but it can send back something, okay? So when it goes one way, what happens with the AI training is that a machine learning software system is used to teach that robot arm to recognize when Nathan Copeland wants to do anything. And he tries to think about it, and it gets better over time because that's what machine learning does. So his robot arm has performed better over time as he's used it because it gets better at recognizing his signaling. So it's not an instant thing, it takes time. But because machine learning, it gets better. The signal going the other way, this arm has been engineered for sensation. And this is the last lesson, right? I'm going to talk, so I'm going to make my claim here. What do I mean by that? Sensation is sensing, okay? It has been engineered to not only respond to inputs for it to move, but it will sense what it's touching. It will sense pressure. It will sense texture. It will sense different kinds of material on the surface of what it's feeling. In other words, and it will create signaling and send it back through, and this is a wireless communication, by the way, sends that signal to a wireless receptor for that brain chip. And that brain chip sends that signal through Nathan Copeland's neural tissue, his brain tissue, to a very specific place. That's why you have to have multiple electrodes multiple arrays on this electrode because it's not like you just put it anywhere in the brain and you can feel it. There are very specific regions of your brain that control very specific parts of your body and that interact with it, and for certain very particular sensations. So it's engineered to sense pressure and texture and things like heat and cold. And it creates the signal for heat and cold. And it just sends it back to the brain. And that's why Nathan Copeland can feel Barack Obama's hand, because your biological hand does the same thing. When you reach out and touch something and you feel that something, it's just creating signaling. That's what it's doing. And it's sending that back to your central nervous system, and your brain takes those signals and it does what we saw earlier. It creates something out of it, okay? The last thing I want to say, just add because I should have pointed this out earlier. You've been listening to the sound of my voice, right? But you know where the sound of my voice is coming from by now, if you didn't realize before. From you. It's coming from you. That's why you can dream. Yeah, you can feel water. The feeling of the water is coming from you. You can dream of going to the opera, and you hear all this beautiful singing. I mean, it wouldn't be me. I'm not a beautiful opera singer. But you can experience that, and you get the sound. Remember, the electrical impulses are not sound. They're just electrical signaling. Somehow, there has to be a way of getting experience of sound from that. And the sound is the experience. And that's why you are generating the sound of my voice, and I'm not. I'm just vibrating air. That's all I'm doing. And those vibrations create electrical signaling. But you do something with the signals. And what you do is that experience. And that's why the science of the soul was so important, because they were saying, well, how do you go from one thing to the other? And what they claimed, and what I'm now going to disagree with, what Ibn Rushd and many, not all, many of those in this tradition claimed, is that material entities are not capable of transcending the specificity and the particularity of their materiality. That if you have your apparatus that you're working with, you have your equipment, and I've got my equipment, and someone else has their equipment, and we're listening to a song, or we're walking down the road, or we're watching a beautiful sunset, what the science of the soul says is that they all have different equipment, but they're going to experience a common reality. And even before we get to the question of the individual versus the group, the individual is taking signals, inputs, and they're doing something with it to create experience, like the taste of chocolate, which I'm telling you, and if you've ever, maybe you don't like chocolate, think of something that you do like, salted tofu, whatever. It's not electrical signaling. It's this amazing, beautiful experience, or it could be horrific experience. But that's not the same thing as the electrical signaling. You are creating that. You are. And you can't know what the sound of my voice sounds like to the person sitting next to you or somewhere else. It, like pain, is also subjective. But that doesn't mean that there is no such thing as a common reality of pain or a common sound of my voice. It's just that you're creating it, which is the puzzling thing. Well, if different people are creating it, but there's a common reality, how do you explain that with specific material? So the importance of the science of the soul is relevant today, not depending on whether you think there's a soul, but because of the rigor of the method. And when you look at this example of Nathan Copeland, who feels the handshake with Barack Obama, you have to concede that we've become successful at engineering robot arms to sense. The question is, can they feel? See? Can they feel? They can sense pressure. They can sense heat and cold. They can sense texture. But can they feel texture? Can they feel heat and cold? Or are they just signaling? Is that all they're doing? Now, you've heard a lot of people weigh in on ChatGPT, and I'm not, no one can give a talk today about AI and not at least mention ChatGPT. So I've mentioned it. Come on. This is not about ChatGPT per se, but people have readily observed it doesn't really know anything. Maybe it doesn't, but maybe we don't. Or maybe a lot of things we think we know, we're responding to different things. And it's the experience even of being a subject and having knowledge is very complicated. It's not simple. But because it's so complicated, I think we have to be more humble and cautious about ascribing limitations to who or what might feel any particular thing. After all, okay, so science is so. After all, what if we are material entities? And we are material entities. But what if the transcendence is actually that? In other words, what if it's the case that the ability of humans to experience all of those amazing things or horrible things, pain, love, jealousy, anger, cement, sandpaper, light, warmth, is material? Because what keeps happening in the scientific study of cognition is that we see signaling and we say, well, I don't see any knowledge, I just see signaling. We see biochemical processing and fluctuations in ionic concentrations and the changes in blood circulation in different regions of the brain. But we say, yeah, we see the differential in the circulatory patterns, but that's not knowledge. It's just signaling. And we never see knowledge. But what if we're missing knowledge because, like the scientists of the soul, whether we're secularists or not, we have reached some kind of consensus, not everyone, but I'm generalizing, that signaling is a physical thing and knowledge has to be some different kind of thing. And every time we study cognition or observe a machine system doing something or watch a human-machine hybrid, we just want to claim that there's signaling there, but feeling and knowledge is not happening in the machine, and feeling and knowledge is not happening in the cells and the electrical ionic concentration differentials that's processing those signals through the body. What if that's it? What if that's it? So what I want to end with is this. Can robots feel pain? I want to say, perhaps, I want to say that there is nothing inherent to the nature of material entities. Okay, there's nothing inherent to the nature of material entities, and I'm going to say humans are material entities. We can have a debate about whether there's more there. Do we have something else that's not material? Perhaps. But there is nothing inherent to the nature of material entities that would preclude their ability to transcend the particularity of their materiality. In fact, it is perhaps in the nature of things to feel. So I'll stop there. I want to thank you for this talk and love to hear you can have questions, but you might also have responses and comments and vigorous dissent, which I welcome because I can't prove any of this, but I'm trying to figure it out. But thank you very much.
That was an amazing talk. I really enjoyed that quite a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for.
I'm going to apologize ahead of time. You have quite a lot of my students are studying cognitive neuroscience and consciousness.
Oh, terrific. Great.
And most of them will probably give you a materialistic view. So they're probably going to agree with you, but give you a hard time.
Okay, terrific. Excellent.
I guess my comment is the thing that struck me when you were saying material things are limited and that going from sensation to feeling is like transcending something. And I guess I would say, why do we need that?
Yes.
Why can't it just be that signaling that's happening and we just call that sensation or experience?
Yeah, that's great.
I love to hear your answer.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So I actually agree. So I should have been clearer about the arc of my talk because I'm doing a couple of things. I'm rehearsing the science of the claims and normative paradigms of the science of the soul. And so then it starts to sound like I'm claiming that. But what I'm doing is rehearsing Ibn Rushd for you when I say that there's signaling and then there's this other thing. And then at the end, what I say is, here's my claim. Can robots feel pain? I'd say perhaps, because what I want to suggest is that it is in the nature of things to actually be able to feel. But I do appreciate the point you're making. But why use the term transcend, right? Why is feeling not signaling? And I think that's a great point, because I actually want to agree with you, right? That we don't need to say that that signaling is here and there is this other thing. However, I do want to appreciate what I think is a fair point, that so I want to say that there can be a pattern of electricity that is not, at least not always, feeling. Is every electrical pattern that ever exists at any time, or any, it doesn't have to be electrical, like any kind of pattern, because this is not, it's also biochemical. It's also I mean, you know this because you're teaching it, right? That there's several things going on in neuroscience, in neural processing, rather. And some of it is electrical, and some of it is microfluidics. You know, there's very small shifts in circulations of blood. And some of it is other forms of shifts in biochemistry that are not necessarily electrical. And so what I'd want to say is not every single occurrence of an electrical pattern or biochemical shift, not every single one is always knowledge or feeling, etc. But maybe it is. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. And I would actually want to elevate what you're calling for, because this hard binary that has been so practiced, not by everyone. This is one particular set of epistemology. There are many global epistemology. Many human beings, we've come up with lots of different ways to account for our world, and some of those things are very much unifying and unified in their understanding of what things do and what can have agency, et cetera, and others are very different. So this is one that has a hard binary. But that binary, I think, is going to become a barrier to some of the things that we need to figure out soon. And so to make an argument for what you're calling for, this is 2014 Nathan Copeland, and this is actually maybe 2015 or 2016 when this picture's taken. But he got implanted in 2014. And there's a lot of progress and funding that's going into brain-computer interfaces. The Pentagon is really serious about this for multiple reasons. One, lots of soldiers get traumatic brain injury. And two, there are aspirations to enhance people for warfare, so they can just, even if they're not injured, to do all kinds of things. And the capacity is going to get a lot better, and the genetic engineering is going to get wed to that. Okay, you can design differently at the level of DNA and cellular structures and combine that with machine systems. So it's fair to say, for example, that if we insist on this binary, we could end up dehumanizing people who are like Nathan Copeland, who rely on machine systems for lots of things, not just for handshaking, but for experiencing what we call memory or love. And if we want to claim that there's sensing over here and there's feeling over there, and someone has a neural implant that's not just about shaking a hand, because that's seen as a motor skill, even though that's a problematic binary, you know that, but also for emotional, affective responses, then you'd have to end up saying that people who have these implants in the future don't have the capacity to really love someone fully. That some of that is just signaling. So I love the point you're making, and that's what I was trying to gesture toward, but I think what you're pushing is, yeah, but we need to go further than what I was suggesting. And we can have a couple of questions at a time if you want, because I think we're going to stop at 6, right?
Really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
I actually, so I had a bit of a different question.
Mm-hmm.
There's this, the idea of the practice of deep learning, right, which is a subset of machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
There's this concept called multimodal learning, which is essentially the combination of different forms of learning. So textual learning, auditory, visual, and it kind of resonated with me when you brought up the slide of the tree, right? When you were saying, it's not only the kind of the visual, but also the imagination behind it. There were all these different kinds of components. And so a lot of these, big tech companies who are developing these neural networks want to focus on this multimodal idea, because you don't only want to focus on just text or just images, you want to try and recreate consciousness by bringing together all these different forms of learning, which is what humans do. Right. So I just kind of wanted to hear your opinion about this, and what do you think? Do you think that is a key point for the future of AI? And yeah.
Absolutely. So thanks for your question. And I'm going to say, let's do two questions at a time, just so, and I'll try to practice more economy in my responses because I talk so long, so go ahead.
Okay. My question's pretty simple. Do you think that if a singular AI, like just artificial intelligence, not bionic like Nathan there, do you think that if they pass the Turing test, if they are clearly reasonable, should they be conferred political rights?
Yes, that's a terrific question. So, I'll start with the first one, is the multimodal. Do I think that has relevance for the future of AI design? I think absolutely. Some of the most important algorithmic design that needs to be richly developed for future applications is around ethical decision-making. And any of you who've studied AI, I think you're probably familiar with what's called the trolley problem. If a trolley is going to crash and hit people, and you had to minimize death, would you cause it to kill fewer people who might be younger and haven't lived very long, or kill, more older people who've had a chance to live their lives, or something like that? How do you actually make an ethical decision? And many people would say you cannot make ethical decisions about whom to kill. The whole thing. The problem is that people are going to get killed. And if you don't, and autonomous transportation is already rolling out. It's not fully autonomous, but it's already mitigating things. And so I think that we need humanities leadership in the design of technology. And I mean that not reductively, but in a robust, additive way. So that doesn't mean we don't need everything else. Another way of saying this, we need everyone, but we especially need humanists who either really enjoy the significance of working alongside people who were trained in other disciplines, including technical disciplines, to work in private industry, in education, in policy, to figure these things out. But the most immediate point, yes, if you actually included multimodal design and AI architectures, arguably you could get more reliable decision-making around some of these ethical issues. And I'm saying that recognizing that AI will always have all kinds of problems, that human values, if any humanists who study human history know humans have a very problematic record of values. We have great, people-loving social justice values, and we also have dehumanizing, murderous forms of values. And so we can't even simply say, we're just going to take human values. Well, hold on, which human values? Again, we'd be more precise with that. And then the question about the second question about whether something that passes the Turing test should have rights. I do think that there needs to be I think we need a different epistemology, a different set of norms, of ethical norms, of political rationalities or paradigms to deal with these issues. And I'll say this quickly. I'll start with Nathan Copeland, okay? So we are going to see more people in the future, more humans in the future humans who are different from us by design because of genetic engineering, precision medicine. So that's changing at the level of their DNA and cell structures. their capacity to survive disease. There was the scientist in China who was incarcerated for modifying twin embryos to make them immune to HIV. So he's out of prison now. And what he did was illegal. It was against the ethical regulations in China, but he's out of prison now. And he's continuing to do research on genetic engineering, and he wants to tackle muscular dystrophy and try to make that something that humans never have anymore. There are billions of dollars being spent in this to modify people genetically, but also through machine technologies. We're going to see more people who are part machine. And my way of getting to that question, of how to answer that question, is through that. So if we have someone who's part machine, for whatever reasons, they could have a cochlear implant, they could have something that is way beyond what our capacity is today to engineer. Are we going to say that they are in any degree less human than someone who's not part machine? And I think the answer to that question has to be no. And I think that this way to summarize that is that the problem that is embedded in that question has been treated largely as an ontological problem. That is, how do you know find out what things are made of, and let's figure out, are these entities made of the same stuff? And if you and I made the same thing, we'll say, oh great, we're both human, we'll slap each other on the back, and then we'll enjoy our rights together. And if something else or someone else, they don't have the same stuff as we have, they're not made the same stuff that we're made of, we're going to say, they're different, so we're going to start to modulate the rights that they have. So that's treating it as an ontological problem. If we treat it as a political problem, and not an ontological problem, the problem is not I have to figure out what you're made of, but rather the economy of ethical obligations cannot be based on what you're made of or what I'm made of. It has to be based on some other kind of framework. Then the answer to the question is yes, I do think that we are going to have to recognize agency and personhood in these different kind of entities that are going to get created through genetic engineering. We're humanizing non-human animals. Right now we're doing it for transplants. So last year, the first human to have a pig heart transplanted into that human, and the pig was humanized. His DNA was changed to make it a little bit more human and a little bit less pig, so the human who received the heart transplant would not reject the heart. First one happened January of 2022, over a year ago. And they lived 2 months with that heart. I think we're going to see more of that. I think we're going to see more machines. That's complicated, because you can say, well, what kind of rights are you talking about, Sylvester? And then I'll back into, well, I'm one person, I don't know. But I do think that that's a direction that we have to go, and I think there are global traditions of ethics that have already embedded those recognitions of some kind of ethical obligation and recognition of personhood in non-human entities, whether it's rivers or plants or the environment, and honoring those things and treating them as having the right not to be polluted, for example, not because of what it does to humans, but what it does to the river, or other kind of examples. So yes.
Thank you for your very stimulating lecture. Would robots be able to feel pain? Sure, why not? Except we don't know whether that's going to be pain or something else. We are operating with so many old traditional views that are outdated, and our language is based on those assumptions. I think what has become clear, not only through our work in artificial intelligence, but in many other areas of human experience, is that we have outdated epistemology, as you said, we have outdated ethics, we have outdated metaphysics, we have outdated pretty much everything. And we are right now in the process in collapsing these old views, like the Cartesian dualism of body and soul, and how the soul or spirit comes from above and the matter is below, and all of these kind of things. We need a lot of new things, and the example you pointed out is certainly very good. Nate Copeland was able to feel the sensation in the hand. But it was not the machine that was feeling the shake of Barack Obama's hand. It was Nate Copeland who, with the help of a machine, was able to feel what other normal human beings feel without the machine. We don't know exactly what the machine will be able to feel. Would it be able to feel something? Almost certainly, if they already don't feel it now. Let me use another example, go back to another example that's similar to the one that you had with the game of Go. I'm a chess master. I remember when Deep Thought beat the greatest chess player of all times, Garry Kasparov, like a child. Any, however bad computer can beat me, even though I'm a chess master. If I draw 1 of 50 games, I'm very happy. So every computer plays chess way superiorly than we do. But do they have the same experience when they play chess? Is it called thinking? Is it called calculation? They perform way better than we do. They perform, and maybe that will be extremely important in future with regard to pain, a number of ethical questions. I'm pretty sure that it would be very important, but I'm not sure that we'll ever be able to know exactly, is it pain? Because again, we are going back to a very dated and ambiguous common sense language that we are trying to apply for something that's of a kind of a different world and a different order of reality. So if you would comment on that, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And the other question?
Thank you. You've raised some interesting questions, and I think Petrak asked some other good points as well. As an unrepentant materialist, I'd like to ask, don't you need to start bringing in the idea of evolution here? Because pain, joy, humor, fear aren't just the way we respond to stimuli. They're the way we respond to stimuli now after 4 billion years of evolution. And doesn't that need to be a vital part of looking at the new paradigms or the new epistemology?
Thank you. These are great, really terrific questions, very insightful. So again, the first question being about making the point, we don't know what the machines are feeling. So that's true. We also don't know what other people are feeling. The difference is that they can tell us, right? And that doesn't mean we always listen, because those women whom Mary and Sims were torturing absolutely attested to their pain. And he just continued doing what he was doing. But yeah, we don't know what other people feel. However, we communicate about it, and that's not always efficacious, but it's fair to say I think that it usually is. Right? There's lots of complexity there. There's lots of studies. People go to doctors and complain of pain, depending on who they are, racial, gender, demographics. Healthcare providers respond differently. But still, people can communicate. How can you communicate with a machine? Well, we can communicate with machines, but we will, just as you can't know what another human is experiencing, you're still listening to them and they're trying to convey that. We will never know in any precise way what a machine is experiencing. I agree with you. The point that we have these outdated concepts, I would add there are also concepts that have been around a long time that I think have gotten marginalized in some contexts, that are more embracing of various, finding and recognizing some kind of ethical obligation with entities outside of, well, you have to be a homo sapiens, a human being. But you're right, we don't know that. And I think there has to be some kind of cultivated sensibility to those differences. What happens when we don't know? And that's part of why I said that this is not just an ontological problem, it's a political problem. I shouldn't need to know. Victoria Braithwaite was a British biologist focusing on the study of fish, who wrote a book arguing back in, I think it was 2010, 2012, about a decade ago, arguing that fish could feel pain. And she was condemned pretty widely at the time by many biologists. Not that no one agreed with her, but the majority of people who responded to her work claimed that her methodology was off. And basically their argument was that fish they have a different, their nociceptors are different from human nociceptors. And so they said there's no way that Victoria Brathwaite could have known that they felt pain. And her response was, it's like saying the fish can't swim because they don't have arms and legs, right? Because that's how humans swim. You shouldn't use the difference to deny the capacities that are there. In terms of the question you were asking about the larger issue of this concern over the different approaches to even trying to map these experiences, and you were raising a particular point about what, remind me again, the
Evolution.
yeah, the evolutionary role. Yeah, so
In creating pain.
right. So I think that absolutely has to be there. We are absolutely evolutionary in our experience of the world, and you're right. It's not just millions. I loved your point about billions of years. It's not just early hominids. Is that we are descended from all kinds of things that are not humans. And even early, these early hominids, like when did these hominids actually become human is a great question itself. But I love your point about the billions, going back to that. So yes, right? And that has to be part of this. It has to be a synthetic approach. And we have to take very seriously all the different factors that constitute things that we might feel like we're making decisions about, but we're not really making decisions about those things. Sometimes our gut bacteria are making decisions, for example, right? Because part of this evolution is that we have evolved to coexist with them. So biological human women have the capacity to produce a protein in their breast milk that is completely, that has zero nutritional value for human babies. You know what it has nutritional value for? Their gut bacteria. Right? We have evolved the capacity to feed these bacteria that colonize our gut to make sure that they thrive so it feeds the gut bacteria in the baby. It doesn't feed the baby, but the baby needs the gut bacteria. So it's not even just human evolution, it's the evolution of all of these things that constitute it. So you're absolutely right, and it needs to be part of it. There's a lot of complexity. I think the point of the neuromorphic architectures is to build on that evolutionary paradigm, and that doesn't mean that machines are going to react in the same way. I think when I thought about the example of a cochlear implant. People who have cochlear implants can engage in conversations, they can listen to music, they can hear sounds around them, but it's not the experience of the sound is not the same as that which would be produced by human cochlear cells. That doesn't mean there's not sound. This doesn't mean there's not hearing going on. It's just it's a little different, but they can still have conversations. Is that difference due to the fact that there's something that those cells have captured through evolutionary processes that's not getting reproduced in the manufacture of those cochlear implants? I don't know. But it does reinforce the importance of your question. So thanks very much. Thank you very much.